Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to You and Your Health. Thank you so much for tuning into the program this evening. My name is Brca Roberts-Hilton, a co-host of this program, and I have my other co-host, Dr. Edward Isuman. Hi, Dr. Eddie.
Hi, Rekwa.
You sound so excited that I'm back.
Yeah, because some of the burden is lifted.
Thank you so much for covering last week, for playing double duty. I know it was a bit
Yeah,
challenging,
it
but
was a lot of.
certainly appreciate it to get some time off. And want to thank Dr. Ainsworth as well for sharing her wisdom on cardiovascular diseases. Dr. Eddie and Dr. Joy did a great job. If you have not looked at that program, we ask that you tune in to take a look, and also definitely do share with others. So, Dr. Eddie, you want us to say some of the good news about Janelle?
Yeah, tell us. Yeah,
So,
listen.
so Janelle had her surgery last week.
Mm-hmm.
Baby Janelle, for those who are tuning in for the first time, she had congenital heart disease, a hole in her heart, and she actually had surgery last week in India. So she's doing well, she's recovering, but please keep the family and her in prayer. Pray for speedy recovery. She knows she was a tiny little baby, and so, but she is in recovery and she is doing great. And we're grateful for all of you who supported her journey to India. Yeah.
For,
All right.
for
Well,
ethical reasons, I can't share her picture. I would have shown her picture of
no.
her recovering and.
Yeah. Yeah. But she's doing good. She's doing good. She just needs additional prayers to kind of pull her out. And so, again, we're grateful for everyone who contributed towards her trip. So let's get started. Since you warned me there's a program already this evening.
Exactly.
Okay, so our discussion this evening is on cancer genetics, which is a very hot topic. Why so many people get cancer? Is it in our gene? Can it be prevented? How can we stop our loved ones from catching cancer? There are so many unknowns. Luckily for us, we have one of the best trained experts in the area by the name of Dr. Charlotte Campbell to share her expertise on this topic. Dr. Campbell is an attending surgeon in gynecologic oncology at the Washington Hospital Center, which is Washington Cancer Institute at MedStar Health in Washington, D.C. She was born in Dominica and moved to the U.S. when she was 4 years old, spending the rest of her childhood in central Michigan. Dr. Campbell received her Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Michigan and her medical degree from the University of Michigan Medical School, while also completing a master's in public health at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health as a medical student. She completed her residency training in obstetric and gynecology at Duke University, where she also co-founded the Coalition of Black Physicians, which serves to build community amongst all African American residents at Duke University. She went on to complete her fellowship in gynecologic oncology at Columbia and Cornell Hospitals in New York City. She's in fact no stranger to Ghana, as I indicated in my earlier posting. She has been to Ghana 3 times, working at Kolabu, Konfanache, and Kennard's Hospital as part of her medical training. Dr. Campbell's research has focused on health services delivery, specifically on outcomes for patients who receive gynecologic surgical care at safety net hospitals. She's an active member of the Society of Gynecologic Oncology, the National Medical Association, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, and the American Society of Clinical Oncology. She enjoys caring for patients and their families, listening to pop culture podcast, and mentoring future physicians of color. Let us welcome Dr. Charlotte Campbell. Hi, Dr. Campbell.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's such a treat to be here. Such an honor.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I was so excited when you said, I have been to Ghana before 3 times during our discussion last week. So I wanted to get your feedback about Ghana. How was Ghana? How was the people? How was food?
Oh, it was amazing. So I initially went to Ghana as a pre-medical student when I was still in college. through a partnership the University of Michigan had with the Corley-Boo Hospital. And then I went back as a medical student and then back a third time as a fellow. So at every single level of my training, I've had the pleasure and the privilege to be in Ghana for, at least months on end. And I loved it. Red continues to be my favorite dish. I tried to perfect it when I came back to the US, and some of my Ghanaian classmates said I did like a pretty adequate job, but I'm not going to give any bragging rights here, but it was just such a treat. Kumasi is amazing, and Accra is hot.
Oh my goodness.
Busy, and I really enjoyed all the time I spent there.
I'm glad you're dead. And certainly, definitely keep going back. Like Eddie said, you should keep going to Ghana whenever you get a chance to. So.
Absolutely. When the opportunity arises, you will find me on that plane. I think there are direct flights from DC.
Right. United just started direct flights. So
I need to get one of those tickets.
So how many trips left for you for this year to end?
Oh, how many trips to go? Well, you know how expensive it gets over the holidays. So I think we're going to have to put a pass on this year. Maybe next year we get a trip in.
Okay. That'll be fine.
She knows that it gets expensive towards the holiday. So that tells you she's half Ghanaian. She's been there multiple times.
Multiple times.
So anyway, but it was just awesome to hear that you have been there, and to be on this program to share your expertise with our community is we're just thrilled to have you here. So if you're ready, we can go ahead and Dr. Eddie can project your slides for you.
Great, wonderful. So thank you guys again. Hopefully this talk is around 35 to 40 minutes. So there's time and opportunity at the end for some questions and answers. I'm happy to take any questions you guys have now or later on. Feel free to pass them on to our moderators. Today's talk, I want to spend some time talking about the Brca gene and then beyond into kind of cancer genetics specifically related to breast and ovarian cancer in kind of the latest and greatest science that we have now in 2021. Again, thank you so much for having me for this talk. It's such a treat and honor to be here. We'll go to the next slide. I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. Next slide. So although we're talking about breast and ovarian cancer and the genetics related to that, I want to put a caveat first to make sure we have them in like the interest of all of our audience members that these cancers can affect men as well. So not just people with female reproductive tracts, but also people with male reproductive tracts. Breast cancer is something that can affect men, and there are other cancers that can develop from mutations in the Brca gene that can affect men. So this is not a talk just for women or people with female reproductive organs. This is a general population talk, and specifically really, really important for people of the community within the African diaspora around the world. This is Matthew Knowles, Beyonce's dad. My interest in pop culture comes out here. He had breast cancer, and related to genetic mutation that he has that we'll get to throughout the rest of the talk. And this is he can get it, anyone can get it. So my outline for today's talk, I'm going to start with a few basics about the Brca gene, what it is, how we think about it from a scientific perspective, and a little bit of the brief history when it comes to the politics and policies behind it. That's where my interest in healthcare policy comes into play. And then kind of why we care about it from a physician standpoint, from helping to both prevent cancer as well as treat cancer, where we fall short in the medical and community and the health services community in terms of bringing genetic testing to our patients and communities, as well as the knowledge gaps that we have and room to grow in the science of understanding cancer genetics. And then lastly, where we go next, where the scientific community is moving in terms of further testing and population screening, as well as what patients can do and what you can do to arm yourself with this information that you gain from this talk. So talking about Brca basics, kind of a brief history. So this next slide I have here is a slide that I show sometimes to my medical students when I introduce them to what a Brca gene is and why it's important. So when we think about breast cancer and ovarian cancer, two cancers that we think of predominantly as women's cancers, but again, breast cancer can happen in men and women. The general population risk of breast cancer is about 1 in 8 women. This is US statistics, will get breast cancer. For ovarian cancer, that risk is much lower. It's 1 in 70, but ovarian cancer can be a deadly disease because most times it's discovered only when it's advanced stage. When you think about someone who has a BRCA mutation, this is a specific mutation in a gene that I will get into in a later slide. This actually affects their cancer risk for breast cancer, for ovarian cancer. These numbers go from, let's say, 1 in 8 people without a mutation will get breast cancer in the United States. If they have a mutation, their risk is 1 in 2. One of these 2 women will get breast cancer. And ovarian cancer, it's about the same. And then when you think about other cancers as well, you'll see on the right side of the screen under that BRCA2 mutation column, there's also an increased risk of prostate cancer, of pancreatic cancer, of gastric or stomach cancers, as well as other cancers. This can include brain cancer. It can include skin cancers like melanoma. It can include pharyngeal cancers, kind of cancer of the neck and ENT. So all of these cancers are increased risk for people who have BRCA mutations, specifically BRCA2. When we think about what these genes are, so these are special kinds of genes that we have in our DNA that are called tumor suppressor genes, meaning they're kind of the safety checks of the DNA pathway. So when the DNA is damaged by whatever process, this can be environmental exposures, lifestyle exposures, smoking exposures, these genes they help to make proteins that fix the DNA before it gets out of control. When you don't have these safety checks in place, these DNA breaks kind of destabilize the cells that they can start overgrowing, and basically lead to cancer. And that's how people who have BRCA genes can be at increased risk of developing certain cancers. Now, not everyone who has a BRCA gene will develop cancer. That's called incomplete penetrance. But as I mentioned on a previous slide, it's actually a substantially increased risk of developing a lot of these cancers if you have a mutation in their gene. Next slide. And as a caveat, there are other mutations that are not necessarily BRCA mutations, but are involved in the same pathway of that safety check for DNA repair and helping the cell to be normal. That if these genes are disrupted or mutated, basically, they don't make the correct proteins to help enforce those safety checks. And cells grow and get completely out of control and can develop into cancer. Next slide. These are the names of the other genes. So when I'm seeing patients who have a history, personal history of ovarian cancer, I'm getting genetic testing, not only on the BRCA1 gene, the BRCA2 gene, but also genes called BRIP1, RAD51D, RAD51C. We used to only test for BRCA mutations. If you meet someone that was genetically tested for these mutations in the 1990s, they probably only had testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2. Now, these days, when we're doing genetic testing, we're testing for multiple genes, including the ones I mentioned on this slide, because they increase the risk of specifically breast and ovarian cancer, as well as the other related cancers I mentioned previously. A little bit of the history of this is that the BRCA1 gene and BRCA2 gene were first sequenced by career scientist Mary Claire King. She's a geneticist and she works out in Seattle at UW, and her lab sequenced this gene back in 1990. She actually won the National Medal of Freedom awarded to her by Barack Obama back in 2016 because of the sentinel work that her lab did basically in the 1990s. BRCA1 in 1990, and then the patents in 1994 and 1995. Political and policy context to this is that when these genes were first sequenced, they were really exclusively owned by a company called Myriad. And they owned basically a patent to these genes, meaning that all genetic testing we did was through this Myriad company. There were no other companies that were able to offer genetic testing. So it was highly specialized, quite expensive for patients, and it led to a lot of barriers in care. And they really had a monopoly on the system through the 2000s, almost 2010s. In 2013, there was a Supreme Court decision that finally said that genetic material cannot be patented. It is part of the genome, and we cannot patent these genes. So we need to be able to open this science and technology up to other companies to be able to offer genetic testing to our patients. Next slide. The specific language they used was saying that we hold that a naturally occurring DNA segment is a product of nature and not patent eligible merely because it has been isolated. And so really with that decision, now we had opening up of all of these other companies that wanted to build this technology and be able to offer genetic services, genetic testing services to patients. And now we have much more competition in the genetic testing sphere. That means for patients specifically, the cost has come all the way down. Sometimes out of pocket, it can be only a couple $100s. And that has created a world of difference when we think about access specifically for marginalized populations. Next slide. One of the other things that's important to understand, sometimes a fear the patients will have is like, okay, let me see, if I get tested though, is this going to affect my health insurance? Am I going to lose my health insurance if they find out that I have a genetic mutation that increases my risk of having these other various serious cancers? And legally, that's not allowed. So the GINA Act, or the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act of 2008, basically disallows insurance companies, health insurance companies, to have any sort of discrimination based on someone's genetic information. And so getting genetic testing should not cause any sort of changes to health insurance as well as unemployment insurance. That was in kind of the Title II of this act. Now, one caveat to this is that genetic testing and getting a specific BRCA mutation result or other genetic results can affect risk of cancer does affect kind of the fancy insurance policies. So this would be like life insurance and disability insurance. And so oftentimes what I will tell my patients is that, you know, to get those, if you're planning on getting those life insurance, disability insurance policies, get those in place before you get genetic testing. But if I'm very concerned, then we just have to go ahead and do it. But that's something to understand. All right, so why do we even care about genetic testing? What does BRCA, the understanding of these genes, do for us? Why does this even matter in the life course of women and men? Next slide. So cancer prevention is a big thing. So if someone is found to have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, as we discussed, the lifetime risk of breast cancer and ovarian cancer increases substantially by magnitudes. We know in the breast cancer world that if we increase screening, like with a MRI or a mammogram every 6 months, that we can generally catch these cancers pretty early at the time when they're very curable. An alternative to this is a preventative surgery, such as a risk-reducing mastectomy, where you actually remove someone's breast tissue and adipose tissue in their chest to prevent them from developing cancer outright. This is kind of the surgery that Angelina Jolie had back probably now a decade ago, where she was, because she found this mutation in herself, decided to undergo a risk-reducing mastectomy, and then you can always get breast reconstruction, and that is covered by all insurance plans as a standard of care for someone who's found to have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, as well as some of the other related genetic mutations. There's also things when we think about in the medical world, you can also take some tablets. Tamoxifen is a tablet that can help prevent the development of breast cancer, sometimes for women who they are not ready to yet go forth with the mastectomy option. When we think about ovarian cancer risk reduction, we recommend removal of both ovaries and fallopian tubes for women once they reach age 35 to 40, 45, depending on what kind of mutation they have, that we remove their ovaries and their fallopian tubes to help them never develop ovarian cancer. And that actually helps to reduce their mortality, overall mortality, and patients have lived substantially longer when they don't have this diagnosis of ovarian cancer hanging over their heads. And then an asterisk hysterectomy for BRCA1 mutation carriers, is there some data actually support that as well. We'll go to the next slide. There's another way that BRCA mutations is very helpful in the cancer world. So not only for cancer prevention, which has huge implications for population risk management, but then when we think about cancer treatments, let's say you've got a patient who then undergoes, is found to have a cancer, and then you find out after the fact that, they have a BRCA mutation. These patients tend to actually do better than patients without BRCA mutations, for whatever reason, probably related to that DNA. The cell can't exactly repair itself in the proper way. It turns into cancer. That actually works in favor of treatments like chemotherapy, and a new targeted treatment called PARP inhibitors for ovarian cancer, where because the cell is kind of weak and doesn't have it's not really organized in the way that it repairs its DNA, those cancer treatments can really target those cells that are affected by BRCA and really target those cancer cells and help patients get into a long and durable remission from their cancer. So when I see patients in my clinic who come to me with an adnexal mass, and we do a surgery and we find them to have cancer, all these women automatically get tested. If you have a personal history of ovarian cancer, you get automatically tested. Likewise, for young women with triple negative breast cancers, they also automatically get tested. Now, sometimes women come to my office and they don't have a personal history of breast cancer, but you start asking about their family history, and my mom actually had breast cancer when she was 50, and then I guess I had an aunt who had breast cancer when she was 40, and actually maybe my grandmother had ovarian cancer. And once you start putting these family histories together, you see that sometimes patients meet a certain threshold where, based on their family history alone, they need to be tested for these genetic mutations. And so one of the key take-home points that I want folks to get from this talk is it is so critical to understand what your family history is of cancers, to understand your own risk of developing cancers in the future and your own genetic risk, to see if are you eligible for this genetic testing before you develop cancer. That is something that I think is such a missed opportunity when I have a patient who I've now diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and you look back on their family history and it was so obvious that something was going on in their family history. That is a missed opportunity. And so I want us to really think about our family histories, and I'll show you some tools for that at the end of the talk. So a couple of areas that we fall short in the medical community in terms of testing and being able to offer genetic screening to patients, both with cancer and without cancer, is something that I wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing. Next slide. Wonderful, thank you. So, in the breast cancer world, they've been doing this for a little bit longer than we have, just because breast cancer is so much more prevalent than ovarian cancer. And so there's much better screening process for people with breast cancer than there is for ovarian cancer. So ovarian cancer patients definitely fall short on how often we're testing them, and the uptake kind of the recommendations that changed for ovarian cancer. They changed back in 2010-ish, give or take a couple years, where now we're really trying to do this on a more frequent basis, but we know that we fall short. Next slide. One of the areas that we fall short is that most places have a pathway where, we take someone's family history, or we recognize that they have a personal history of a concerning cancer that is related to a genetic predisposition, and we refer them to a genetic counselor to kind of go through their family history and kind of talk them through what this means and all the nuances of genetic testing. And then actually that genetic counselor is responsible for ordering that test. And we know for patients who are Black, who are Latinx, who are not well insured or underinsured, and who don't speak English, that there's a drop off at every single spot. So they're going to be referred less frequently for genetic counseling, and then they don't necessarily make it to the next step of actually getting tested. And those are huge drop-offs and huge gaps in our cancer delivery system and how we offer genetic counseling to patients. Next slide. So another area that there's a huge kind of gap in the literature is that really when you think about who these who the science is based on. When, yes, Mary Claire King did just such an incredible job sequencing and figuring out BRCA, a lot of the early studies to figure out, okay, there are different kinds of BRCA mutations, right? A lot of these early studies had a population of predominantly white women. Very few women who are Black or of African American descent. And so there was not a very diverse cohort of patients, including these early trials. And so a lot of the mutations that we see, this is based on a cohort of predominantly white or European ancestry patients. And now there's a lot more interest, and there's a few really incredible scientists, Dr. Davis in New York City at Cornell, my old institution, is working really hard on kind of trying to develop a much more robust database on looking at the BRCA variants that affect predominantly Black or African American patients who have cancers and BRCA mutations. Specifically, a couple slides on what this means in sub-Saharan Africa and specifically Ghana. And so this is a study, the senior author is Dr. Lisa Newman, who is a mentor of mine. She's a breast surgical oncologist. She works at Cornell University. She used to be at the University of Michigan and has made countless trips to Ghana and worked very closely with leaders within Corlebu, as well as I think Komfonoche, maybe KNUST. They did a study looking at women with triple-negative breast cancer in Ghana. Triple-negative breast cancer is a special high-risk type of breast cancer that is much harder to treat, is much more closely related to BRCA mutations, and then also happens to predominantly affect women of color and Black women. We know that it's twice as high in our population as compared to white women, and it's really been understudied in sub-Saharan Africa, which is such a gap in the literature. Next slide. What they showed in this study was that out of their population, over 60% of their patients with triple-negative breast cancer had a BRCA1 mutation. Mm-hmm. When you think about is this science ready for prime time in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Cameroon? And you think about the access to care, we're struggling to give it to insured people in the United States who happen to be Black. Like, what are we doing? Like, Myriad doesn't exist in sub-Saharan Africa. And when you think about those huge global disparities, and this missed opportunity, this is a staggering statistic to think about how many people we're missing who have these really, really tough cancers, and how many people we're missing who are at risk of developing these tough cancers, specifically in places such as Ghana, so close to our hearts. This is just another study that says there's just so much limited genomic data and sequencing data out of sub-Saharan Africa. This is published in the JCO, which is kind of the main journal for the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and a big call to action for us to really promote the work and support the work, specifically of African scientists, to do the work within the continent, and not necessarily all American researchers or European researchers parachuting in, grabbing data and pulling out. This is work that can be supported from the US, but really also needs to originate from the continent itself. Next slide. The studies that have really been done so far. Next slide. The studies that have really been done so far, there's been a decent amount of literature out of Nigeria, actually, just given kind of their patient cohorts and their scientific process. You can see here that, I'm sorry, it's probably a little bit small on your screens, the BRCA1, BRCA2 genes, and then the countries in which, and the other host of genes, and the countries in which these genes have been found and studied. And Ghana's not even on this list.
Right, I was going to ask that.
Mm-hmm. I was looking for this. I was like, "Where's that? Why is Nigeria on here?" No. So there's so much more work that we need to do, and that needs to be done. We're not even doing a super great job in the US, as I mentioned, right? So there's barriers to and facilitators to care for BRCA testing for women who are of a Latinx descent in New York City, which is an area that you'd think people would have decent access to care. But, these are competing concerns, right? Genetic testing, genetic counseling is probably number 15 on the lists for people when they lead their daily lives and think about their healthcare in general. You're thinking about your hypertension, your diabetes, and managing those, which are critical importance. I think you alluded to having a talk recently of cardiovascular health and, number one killer, right? So that's really, really important. But then you think about women who actually have breast cancer and not getting genetic testing and not getting referred for that. And the biggest barrier to actually getting testing was not having a referral by their physician, which speaks to systemic racism, bias on the part of healthcare workers, and so much work that needs to be done. Next slide. This is another study that basically looked at patients within Pennsylvania as well as Florida who had breast cancer and how they were treated within the healthcare system. And Black women were much less likely to undergo genetic testing than white women, even after controlling for their income, socioeconomic status, their clinical risk factors, and their attitudes towards testing. And we know that physicians are the gatekeepers, and this is a huge call to action for those of us who have the reins in this regard. Next slide. There are interventions, right? So I mentioned that, one of the gaps in care is that we tend to refer patients to a genetic counselor, and then that genetic counselor orders the testing. I've been in health systems where we just order the testing. I just order the testing. I know they need it. I've gone through their family history, or I know they have a history of cancer. I can just order the testing online. We'll get into a few slides at the end of the talk where I talk about opportunities that patients can actually order their own testing online, not necessarily through like a 23andMe situation, which is a little bit more lay and doesn't necessarily have the robust databases that are needed, but you can order it directly through Myriad and through other companies that are offer medical grade genetic testing. And those are interventions that we know that can work. And really trying to build, the slide is kind of built for like thinking about health systems and policies and how we can improve the care delivery system so that it's easier to just order genetic testing. It's part of the workflow, as opposed to making build-arounds and three extra steps to actually get a patient in through the doors. Next slide. There are models for doing clinics where you can have everything kind of in one place. So when I diagnose a woman who's 35 years old, BRCA, based on her family history, her mother had breast cancer, got tested, and then she was found to have a BRCA mutation. It's nice to be able to take care of these patients in one spot, right? So they see a breast oncologist, they see a gynecologic oncologist, such as myself. They get referred to fertility services so they can get egg harvesting. They have derm referrals, GI referrals, plastic surgery for their breast reconstruction. And it's really nice to have these referral systems in the same place. Dr. Jun Ho, who I got the slide from, leads this clinic up at Columbia University, where I had done my fellowship. Other areas for room for growth, even within this system, is genetic counselors are lacking everywhere in the US. It's just there are too many patients, too few counselors. If anyone's interested in this is a great field to go into. You're highly needed. Care navigators, getting patients through these multiple hoops. If you're in a system that has everything coordinated, that can make it easy, but oftentimes these are disjointed clinics in separate parts of separate health systems, and it's really hard for patients to navigate on their own. This idea of cascade testing, which I'm going to get into in a few other slides, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then thinking about like language barriers and information for patients who don't speak English or are not literate is really important. Okay, so kind of trying to wrap up the talk in the next 10 minutes or so. Where do we go next? So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the science and cascade testing and population screening, and then talking about individual risks and what you can do for your own health today. So this idea of cascade testing, this is a medical term that we use within the oncology societies as well as OBGYN societies to describe, okay, if my mom is found to have ovarian cancer and she is tested and she is found to have a BRCA1 mutation, that means that I, as her daughter, should get I should get genetic testing. And all of my siblings male and female, should get genetic testing. So you cascade away from the person who has that genetic mutation, you cascade and you test all of their relatives, primary relatives, for that mutation. And then you'll be able to find these genetic mutations in these individuals and prevent cancer in that next generation of patients. And so cascade testing is kind of one of the models that we have for being able to kind of more target our testing capacity for patients and their family members. Next slide. This is just kind of another slide I have from Dr. Ho, who heads up our Cancer Institute up at Columbia, where it just showed the feasibility of cascade testing through online sources for patients who had first-degree relatives who had ovarian cancer or breast cancer. And you can see a lot of, like around 50%, 47.5% of those invited underwent testing. 5% had a different pathologic variant from their known family gene. 17% had what we call a variant of uncertain significance, which is kind of, there's something wrong with the gene, but we haven't seen in the literature that it directly ties to cancer, but there's something going on there. And then they found, the usual barriers to care, insurance coverage, a high cost, and it's tough when you have cancer, you find you have a genetic mutation, then you got to tell all your primary relatives you need to get your self-tested. That's a lot for patients to carry while they're trying to deal with their treatment and diagnosis of their cancer themselves. Next slide. The CDC has some great toolkits for physicians as well as providers looking at how we screen for hereditary breast and ovarian cancers and how we think about the registries for this. Next slide. And the state departments of health have some policies that are written out. I took a sample of the Michigan Department of Public Health and what they've written out for coverage. I pulled out kind of a screenshot here. You can see the Michigan Association of Health Plans. The plans are blocked out, so for privacy purposes. But you can see that there's a huge variation in the insurance plans for what they cover in terms of their alliance with recommendations from the U.S. Public Service Task Force, which kind of is the primary care doctor institute for recommendations, as well as when you can see here the primary policies and services obtained. And so there can be a lot of variation within health plans that although technically they meet like NCCN or Cancer Institute guidelines, within these health plans, sometimes we got to argue the point for why these patients need their testing. So there's a huge variation in this. One of the ways that we are thinking of getting around these struggles of insurance coverage is, okay, well, breast and ovarian cancer and these other cancers, cause a lot of morbidity, a lot of mortality. Patients suffer and they die a lot from these cancers. Maybe we should just screen everyone and just everybody gets a screening test when they hit the age of 30, to see if they have a mutation, and then you can act on that. This has been something that Mary Claire King, our scientist who founded BRCA, has called for a matter of years. Hundreds of thousands of lives are at risk each year for developing BRCA mutations and mutations that can affect cancer risk. And specifically within even the Ashkenazi Jewish community, this has shown not everybody who is found to have a genetic mutation actually has a personal history or family history of cancer. So family history isn't perfect. And it doesn't mean that, a negative family history doesn't mean that you're perfectly safe and don't have any risk of developing this mutation. Next slide. One of the big factors that we think about in the scientific community is, okay, so you're going to offer this, it's now more affordable, but it definitely costs at least hundreds and hundreds of dollars to perform genetic sequencing on people. You're going to do this for the whole population. How many patients do you have to do? How many cancers do you have to diagnose and prevent for this to be even cost effective? At what cost level of this test can you now say, okay, this is something that as a public health community infrastructure, insurance companies, we're able to put this money to and know that the rewards of, saving these lives it's worth it, basically. The next slide. This is one of the studies that was published back in 2018 that, looked at, if we did this, if we tested everyone over the age of 30 for a BRCA mutation or related genes, what could we get from this? We found that they could prevent 2% of breast cancers, 5% of ovarian cancers, decrease the incidence of developing these cancers, over 237,000 fewer breast cancers, 65,000 fewer ovarian cancers, and help with mortality, 36,000 less deaths for breast cancer, 45,000 less deaths for ovarian cancer. And as long as the testing costs less than $722, it could be worth our while. And so this is an area that's still hotly discussed. There's out-of-pocket costs, but then there's health system costs. And right now, those total probably a little bit above that $722 threshold. And so this is still an area that's being hotly discussed and debated. So, kind of until then, what do you do? So let's say this is kind of the, what I want you guys to gain from this talk is, okay, if I have a personal history of cancer, I've never gotten genetic testing, or, my loved one has a personal history of cancer and I don't think they ever got genetic testing. Or now that we're talking about this, I think I have an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, a sister who has, breast, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, all these cancers. What do I do? What's my next step? Next slide. There's good news. There's a lot of information you can find online. This is one of my favorite websites for both people with cancer and people without cancer. It's called facingourrisk.org. You can see they're highlighted in the yellow box. And so it's a kind of a website that really has a lot of information from the genetic standpoints for people with and without, or with and at risk for developing hereditary cancers. It has a lot of information on the thresholds and kind of what you should think about when it comes to your family history. It has some steps on how to get both genetic counseling as well as genetic testing, and where you can find more information about the cancers that you're at risk for. And so I would highly encourage you guys to write this website down and take a little bit of a browse later on when you have some time, just to understand this, if this is something that this talk is bringing up for you. And, another step is, if you have a personal history of cancer, talk to your oncologist. There are some cancers that are really not hereditary. For example, cervical cancer. It's not hereditary. So if you have cervical cancer, you don't need genetic testing. That's not something you need, unless you got a family history of all these other cancers that are hereditary, right? So it's important to understand, is my cancer something that's can be passed on from generation to generation, or is this something that's related to having the HPV vaccine, or having HPV, or smoking? And talking to your oncologist about that, and then talking to your primary care doctor if you have if you have a strong family history. Please go back to the slide above it. And then if you don't have an oncologist, or you're not really connected to a primary care doctor, you can actually do some of this yourself and figure out if you qualify for testing. And you can actually order this stuff online. And sometimes it's actually covered by insurance, or sometimes it comes as a couple $100 out of pocket costs. So these next couple of slides explain the way you can do this. Next slide. So I encourage, again, I mentioned this earlier, medical grade genetic testing companies are the way to go, as opposed to, let's say, the 23andMe option, because these companies, again, Myriad, they had a patent on this in the 90s. They've been doing this for decades, right? So they're robust. They have a huge database that they can pull from when they sequence your genes. They've been doing this for a long time. They have a lot more data than kind of the more lay companies. And you can take a quiz. If you go to myriad.com, I have no benefits. I get no money for this from this company, but I think it's a really great tool that they have. I just took a test myself last night to see what the workflow is like. And you can take an easy quiz that goes through your family history and says if you qualify for testing, and that has genetic counseling and testing options directly through Myriad, through that site. Next slide. Another company, just so you guys know I'm unbiased, is called Invitae, so www.invitae.com, where you can go and find more information about these cancers and then also take a quiz and get testing directly from that site. I think sometimes Invitae might be a little bit more affordable than Myriad, but it depends again on your insurance coverage and what that's like. And you can do this around the world. These services are available and something to really look into. So let's get back to Beyonce's dad. So Matthew Knowles, he was found to have breast cancer in 2019 because he noticed some bloody discharge that he found on his shirt, so it was coming from his nipples. And after his surgery, he was found to have a BRCA2 mutation. Interestingly, it was only then that he thought, oh, my aunt and my mom had died of breast cancer. And then he looked at his family history and had a great aunt that had died of breast cancer. And 4 of his father's 6 brothers had died of prostate cancer. This is a classic family history for someone who's at risk of BRCA2. So his finding of breast cancer is really a missed opportunity, because he could have been, this is a classic family history. Someone could have taken this history, should have taken this history. And this is why it's important for everyone here who's listening to this talk and our loved ones to really understand and know your family history and talk to your doctors about it, because his cancer could have been prevented. Importantly, Beyonce and Solange were tested. They don't have BRCA2. The world is safe. But it is important to understand that, this affects men. It affects our families. It's very, very, very important that we understand our cancer family history. Next slide. So in conclusion, a couple of things I want you guys to gain from this talk: understanding that BRCA1 and 2 increases our lifetime risk of cancers, not only breast for both men and women, but ovarian, prostate, pancreatic, gastric or stomach cancers, and melanoma. Genetic information both helps to lower cancer risk through surgery and imaging and medications, but also helps us to treat in certain cancers. Screening predominantly has been based on family history, but we're trying to move to an area where we test based on kind of cascade testing and a knowledge of a BRCA or genetic mutation. Then the next steps eventually down the road might be some version of population testing. But there are inequities in the system that are systematically flawed and designed to do a disservice to our most marginalized communities, both in the US as well as abroad, although there are interventions that need and must be leveraged to help with this. There's still a lot of unknowns with genomic sequencing, specifically in the Black and African American population, due to our historic underrepresentation of research. And so I encourage you guys, if anyone is able to participate in some of these genomic studies, this is a huge service to our community worldwide. And then the last most important point is, the one thing that we know works is to really understand your family history and ask for genetic testing or seek it out yourself if you can. And these are some websites that help with that. And I mentioned the direct testing that you can do as well through Myriad and Invitae. So with that, I will end. Thank you guys for your attention. One of our life heroes, Angelina Jolie, has always stated it's got to be a priority to ensure that more women, and I would say and men, can access gene testing and life-saving preventative treatment, whatever their means and background, wherever they live. And I think this rings true for us even more today as it has in the past. Thank you so much for your attention. I will take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell. Dr. Eddie, do we have any questions? If you have any questions, if you don't mind projecting it. So while he's looking to, go ahead.
I think you can go ahead with your questions, and then I will come in with the ones that I
did you have. Okay, so I have a question in terms of family history. So if a person who has family history of pancreatic cancer, as well as prostate cancer, so dad had prostate cancer, maybe another family member had pancreatic cancer, would you suggest that the children then perhaps have genetic testing done?
Yeah, so it really depends sometimes on the age of people who've had the cancers. Sometimes for patients who've, like, let's say breast cancer or prostate cancer diagnosed when someone was like 85 or 90, then it might not be as genetic typically something that raises a red flag. Young cancers that affect people when they're like, let's say, less than 50 years old, those are red flags. That really shouldn't be happening. When you got someone who's young who has cancer, there's something going on in their genetic code. Something is happening, and even if we don't find the answers now, we will in 10 years. And so I would say it depends specifically on the ages that people were diagnosed, and then how closely they're related to you. And so that facingourrisk.org website has a really nice layout of, if you have a family history of this at this age, this is what you should do, and this at this age. And it's sometimes a combination. You need to have 3 people with breast cancer diagnosed at the age. It can get a little bit nuanced and a little bit complicated. Okay. And so it's important to be able to kind of pull up your family history and pull up this website and kind of go through line by line.
To see if it matches.
Qualify. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And also a question about genetic changes after conception, as to whether those could be passed. I know you mentioned cervical cancer, but lung cancer, there's a trend, but obviously could be because it's environmental related. But I'm just curious as to whether any genetic changes that occur after conception can be passed on to other family members, other generations.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are a couple different ways to answer it. So there are some cancers that we find only when, or some genetic differences that we find only when we test the actual tumor cancer tissue itself. So for example, I might have a patient who doesn't have a strong family history of breast, ovarian, pancreatic cancer. When I do her blood testing, I don't see any inherited cancers. But when I actually test the tumor itself, then I might see in that tumor tissue, she has this genetic mutation. This is a nuance, that she has this genetic mutation in her tumor, but because she does not have it throughout kind of all cancers or all cells in her body, it's not a hereditary cancer that she passes on. And so there's some nuances with where that mutation is found. And what this talk I wanted to focus on was really the role of hereditary screening as opposed to kind of that somatic testing of tumor tissue itself that is not kind of generational and passed on. One point you mentioned was in terms of like after conception. And I think it's also important to understand that when you think about like fertility services for people who have mutations, that if you're found to have a genetic mutation, you can actually do testing on embryos. You can qualify for things like IVF and fertility services and do testing on your embryos to see if those embryos have that genetic mutation, and then select for embryos that do not have it so that you know that you won't pass that on to your offspring. And that's something that people oftentimes, like, that's the next step that we kind of forget to tell patients about, that, you know, when you find out you have these mutations, there are ways that you can, even before conception, try to prevent that passing on to the next generation.
Okay, but that would be considered like a mosaic, though. The mosaic embryos, where the so-called will be reverted in utero.
Right. No, this would be like with in vitro fertilization. So really taking embryos and taking egg sperm, fertilizing them, and looking at the embryos with pre-genetic diagnosis, which is something is standard of care for patients with BRCA and genetic inheritable mutations, but oftentimes not offered for whatever reason.
Okay, I think that Eddie has a question.
Okay, so I think there was a question here. How do you know your family history if you don't know their history, or know that your family has it if you don't know your family's history?
So, you know, for patients who don't have their family history, meaning that, you know, this is oftentimes something that I run into with people who have been adopted or don't have, you know, sustainable relationships with their family members for whatever reason. You don't know their history, and that's a little bit of a lack in the system, where we've been family history based for so long with genetic testing that when you don't have that information, there's kind of you don't really know what to do. I would say with that, the most important thing is that you get as much information as you can. And then if you have no obvious family history, then the important things will be to stay up on your doctor's visits and make sure you get your mammograms on time and make sure you have prostate cancer screenings, and really to stay up to date on your health maintenance and colonoscopies and doing things and screening technologies that we know work to help catch cancer early. That would be the most important thing to do. If you don't know your family history, then you'd kind of technically be at average risk. I would also say that one of the things I sometimes will hear in patients is that, like, oh yeah, my aunt had a pelvic cancer, or my uncle had a cancer that was in his bone, but it was actually, a prostate cancer that metastasized to the bone. And so to really kind of nail down, like, where did cancer start? Because sometimes the cancers will spread to places in the body, but that's not where the cancer started at. And so when you're thinking about your family history and trying to gather that from your relatives, really understanding, where did the cancer start? How old was this person when they were diagnosed with this cancer? Those are kind of the important nuances of understanding the family history.
All right. Okay. So now with men,
yes,
how is it easy, or is it easy for men to get surgery? Because mostly the cancer would be behind the nipple, and men have flat chest. So how is it easy to get surgery? And then
mastectomies in men.
The other question is they always say that men can't have post-operative hormone therapy. Is it true?
Post-operative hormone therapy?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a huge caveat. I'm not a surgical, I'm not a breast oncologist, and I don't treat breast cancer. I treat ovarian cancers and cancers that affect people with female reproductive organs. Mastectomies or removing breast tissue in men is absolutely possible. Everyone has breast tissue. Some people don't have a lot of it, and some people have a lot of it. And so it's the tissue itself that is removed when the mastectomy is performed, and that is possible in all human beings because we all have some degree of breast tissue, even though it's not a ton. The other question of can men get post-operative hormone treatment? I actually don't know the answer to that. I would defer that answer to folks who are much more they take care of people with breast cancer all the time, and so I defer that. But I'm happy to look it up and get back to whoever asked that.
I have a breast surgeon at Ohio State. She was actually on and did a program on breast cancer. So I will send her that.
Yes,
I'll send her that question. Right. Do you have any more, Dr. Eddie?
No.
Before we wrap up. Okay. I had a question about how is this regulated, but because of time, we'll probably just have you respond and then we'll post. But
well, maybe we have a comeback some other
time. Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. Thank you so much for this insightful presentation. I'm sure our members gain a lot from it, and we hope you have a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving. And as Eddie said, we hope that you do come back soon. Hopefully next time it won't be so much pressure in terms of trying to rush your discussion. So thank you again.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. Absolutely.
Okay. I mean, next time I think she's going to package something for men only.
She doesn't take care of men. She takes care of women. But yeah, she'll work on it. She'll work on it with Dr. Safwije.
Absolutely. She and I will combine forces. Yes.
Exactly. Okay. Well, thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
That was a nice talk, but we have just 1 minute to go.
Yes, so let me wrap up and then we can go. Thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back next week with Dr. Wright, Dr. Thelma Wright, on medical malpractice. It's a discussion segment, so we do hope that you either submit your questions in or bring your questions during the program. And as always, if you have any suggestions and comments for us, please email it to emcunyourhealth@gmail.com. We're still in the pandemic. Make sure you get your boosters if you're up for your boosters. Make sure you stay safe and social distance. And happy Thanksgiving to everyone that's watching. Please do tune in for the church program at 8 p.m. Have a wonderful evening. Bye-bye.